Round one of the latest tussle for control of the seas was over, but whilst both sides were reinforcing and gathering their breath, there was still activity around the contested island of Guadalcanal. The Japanese transports had moved in late in the afternoon of the 13th of November, delayed by 24 hours, but not stopped. A scratch force of cruisers was hastily assembled, and combined with the escort force intended for the transport, these were assigned to try bombarding Henderson Field again, whilst the surviving operational units from Abe's fleet were being combined with other vessels to form an even more powerful formation, as whilst the 8-inch guns of the cruisers might disrupt Henderson Field, it was felt that the much more powerful 14-inch guns would be needed to put a really long-term dent in it. With 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and half a dozen destroyers representing a mix of old and new designs, Admiral Mikawa, last seen at the First Battle of Savo Island, headed in under the cover of darkness. 2 ships, Suzuya and Maya, shot up Henderson Field, the rest patrolling just in case US Navy forces were present. But what was left of the US forces from the night before had, of course, withdrawn. As it turned out, allocating only 2 heavy cruisers to the job proved to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The operations of the Cactus Air Force were impeded, but it wasn't put out of action completely. As you might expect, the men of Henderson Field did not take very kindly to this early morning wake-up call, and come dawn, the remaining aircraft, including Dauntlesses from USS Enterprise, which launched a supporting strike, began swarming Mikawa's retreating ships like a horde of angry bees, sinking the older cruiser Kinugasa, first crippling it with torpedoes and then finishing off with bombs from aircraft that followed the oil slick from the first attack, and inflicting sufficient damage on Maya that she would have to go home for repairs, removing her from the theatre for the foreseeable future. They also spotted the transports, which were now critically exposed thanks to the lackluster bombardment the previous night. They then blew through the fighter escort and sent 2/3 of the convoy to the ocean floor, leaving only 4 of the transports and a matching number of destroyers to continue on. Although Admiral Tanaka managed to save many of the men on the sinking transports by rapidly bringing his destroyers alongside, nothing could be done for the food, ammunition, and heavy equipment such as artillery that went down with the ships. The new day, the 14th, also saw the much heavier force under Admiral Kondo heading south. Although spotted and tracked by 2 US submarines, neither sub was able to score successful torpedo hits, but they were able to give the US Navy a heads up that the Japanese Navy was coming back again for a 3rd night. This force consisted of the battle cruiser Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, and the older light cruisers Nagara and Sendai, with 9 destroyers. About half of the total force had been present 2 nights earlier for the first fight. The US was in a bit of a bind. Practically all the cruisers they'd had available at the start of this phase of operations were either sunk or badly damaged, and those few left in the area were needed to guard the Enterprise. There was a similar situation with destroyers, and so Halsey had looked around to determine what surface combatants he had, at all, that were combat capable. Also, they had to be not critically needed for carrier escort, and they had to have enough fuel for a night of high speed and combat operations. He managed to find a grand total of 4 destroyers, all from different units, plus his 2 battleships, Washington and South Dakota. It wasn't a huge force, heavily weighted toward the upper end of things and with a worryingly thin escort screen and a night action that would most likely see torpedoes in the water, and of course it was badly outnumbered by the Japanese. But it was all he had, and so the formation headed off in a line formation, with destroyers leading, then Washington, and finally South Dakota. Halsey had sent them north from Enterprise late on the 13th, expecting them to arrive on the morning of the 14th, to which Admiral Lee aboard Washington had radioed back, "What do you think we have, wings?" As it had turned out, the American ships were operating significantly further south than where Halsey had actually thought they were. South Dakota was also unable to use 2 of the guns on her forward superfiring turret. The barrels had been badly gouged by the bomb hit she'd taken defending Enterprise, and after receiving a detailed description of the damage, the Bureau of Ordnance had eventually radioed back that the guns would not be safe to fire. For his part, Admiral Kondo kept most of his ships together, but sent elements of his escorts out to check his flanks for possible US Navy forces. Funnily enough, unlike earlier battles, both forces had entered the area from the northeast, but the Americans had steered a course southeast after that between Savo and Florida Islands before breaking west to interpose themselves between Henderson Field and the most likely line of Japanese attack, whilst the bulk of the Japanese forces had headed southwest to pass Savo Island with the objective of turning southeast and heading between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, as they usually did. Just before 2300 on the night of the 14th, the radar operators aboard the two American battleships spotted part of the Japanese formation 18,000 yards away, bearing north-northwest. And about 5 minutes later, the Japanese spotted the Americans. However, Admiral Kondo now made a critical error. He and others in the Japanese Navy did not believe it was safe to operate deep-draft battleships in the congested and often shallow waters around Guadalcanal. This, as much as their slower speed, had kept the Japanese Navy from deploying further capital ships like Yamato or Nagato to the area. Well, that and Admiral Yamamoto didn't think that using battleships for shore bombardment was a worthwhile use of their time. To be fair to him, the US Naval War College agreed with Kondo's assessment. Halsey had sent in the battleships not because he wanted to, but because they were the only heavy surface units he had left. As a result, however, Kondo thought the two large vessels were US cruisers, and so he detailed two elements of his force that added up to 2 light cruisers plus 6 destroyers to deal with them, whilst the heavy hitters kept on going to Henderson Field. Whilst this would have been something of a close fight if his assessment had been correct, based on the performance of US surface units in night actions thus far, he did have some reason to be confident that these ships could deal with the American formation relatively easily, at least in terms of driving it off with casualties, if not destroying it outright. Action commenced at 23:17 when the US battleships opened fire at the cruiser Sendai and its 2 escorting destroyers, using their radar to give estimated ranges to the guns. One of Admiral Lee's advancements being to give the radar operators a headset so that they could relay information directly to the ship's gunnery and plotting room officers. The US destroyers watched the glowing battleship shells vanish into the low clouds, and then reappear a short while later 10 miles downrange as they plunged out of the sky again. The bearings changed rapidly as the US ships steamed west. South Dakota fired on the Japanese destroyers using her aft turret, but succeeded only in setting fire to the scout plane sitting on her stern. Another salvo luckily sent 2 of the burning aircraft overboard, and the shockwave put the fires out on the third. However, the Japanese Navy formation turned away from the incoming fire and escaped undamaged whilst laying smoke, although this latter effort was of precious little use against radar-guided gunfire. The interference from Savo Island itself, a factor that had been part of the doom of the Allied cruisers at the First Battle of Savo Island, did however do enough to keep the Japanese ships unscathed. This engagement aside, Kondo's faith in his tactical choices seemed to be borne out, as around the same time that the US battleships ceased fire, as their targets vanished into the darkness, the other part of the Japanese formation detailed to the attack, the cruiser Nagara and 4 destroyers, plus the Ayanami, which was on scouting duty and happened to be in the vicinity, began a fight with the US destroyers, leading the battleships by a few miles. This started out as a hugely one-sided engagement, caught in the crossfire and with their targets hiding both visually and from radar by sticking close to the clutter of Savo Island. The USS Walk and USS Preston were hit repeatedly, blowing out engine rooms, setting fire to torpedoes in their launchers and sending funnels and bits of gun mounts flying. Walk had its forward magazines detonated by a torpedo hit. Both ships were sent to the bottom within minutes, and the 2 remaining ships fared little better. Benham had her face removed by a long lance and staggered out of line, mortally wounded, whilst Gwyn had what little luck was allocated to the US destroyers that night. Hits to her merely knocked out her engines, leaving her adrift and without power. The fight had drifted close enough to Guadalcanal that there was some concern that US PT boats in the area might come out and engage the wrong ships, much as they'd almost done to Portland earlier that month. And so now, for the first time that night, USS Washington stormed into the fight and to the rescue, passing between burning and sinking US destroyers. She and the rest of the US forces that night were led by Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, or Ching Lee to his friends, with the famous transmission going out,
"Stand aside. I am coming through. This is Ching Lee."
As a man who'd helped bring home 4 gold, 1 silver and 1 bronze medal in Olympic shooting competitions in the interwar period, and taken on 3 snipers on his own 6 years earlier during the US landings at Veracruz, coming out the winner, he was something of an expert in gunnery, and also appreciated and understood the capabilities of his ship's radar systems. Some said even better than the operators of the radar aboard the ship did. For that matter, the exercises that he'd put the ship's gunnery's crews through earlier in the war had managed to somewhat confuse even the ship's own master gunners, with Admiral Lee then having to explain to them some of the more advanced solutions to the firing problems he'd presented them with, basically treating the battleship's 16-inch rifles as just gigantic sniper rifles, which of course he understood perfectly. Combined with an already above-average gun crew aboard Washington, Lee's insistence on every gun working to be as accurate as possible now paid off, as her secondary battery engaged Ayanami at very long range. Typically not the greatest scenario for the 5-inch 38, as whilst it was an excellent anti-aircraft weapon, its short barrel meant that it was only passable in a long-range surface action. But they hit it repeatedly, rapidly setting Ayanami ablaze, some small measure of revenge for the mauling the US destroyers had just taken, and distracting the Japanese from finishing off Benham and Gwyn. Still, it was 4 destroyers out of action on the US side, 2 of which had already sunk, in exchange for 1 crippled Japanese destroyer, which was about to sink. Somewhat optimistic reports from the Japanese formation, which was thus now confident of dealing with the 2 remaining cruisers, meant Admiral Kondo considered the US formation defeated, the heavy Japanese ships pressing on towards their objective. Things were about to go badly wrong for the 2 US battleships, though. Washington was about to make a turn to port to avoid some of the remains of the US destroyers when South Dakota started having problems. The blast effects from her main guns had damaged some of her electrical systems, and this, as well as shock, had caused a number of electrical breakers to trip, cutting power to a number of important systems. With power being redistributed automatically and surging through other circuits as the system tried to reroute electricity to keep things operational, various parts of the ship began to flicker internally, as more and more breakers began to trip and were reset, only to trip again. Then one of the engineers, tired of playing whack-a-mole, tied one of the more important breakers down so that it physically couldn't trip. This turned out to be a mistake, and a cascade overload crippled the ship's radar, radios, and power training on most of her guns. With no way of communicating with Washington, South Dakota simply held course whilst men in the switchboard room tried their best to reset the ship's entire electrical grid. Thus, when Benham loomed out of the darkness, staggering away from the fight, South Dakota had no easy way of communicating with her, and no way of telling Lee that she was having to take an opposite turn to starboard to avoid the small destroyer. Unfortunately, this meant she was heading straight towards the Japanese forces, silhouetted against the burning remains of her escorts and without radar, plus with the night vision of her crew well and truly ruined by proximity to the flames. She was almost completely blind, and even if she hadn't been, her guns were still basically non-functional. Systems began to come back online a few minutes after the big power failure, but those few minutes had put South Dakota in a perilous position. As the radar woke up, she found herself barely 5,000 yards away from Kondo's formation, which promptly fixed her in the beams of numerous searchlights before opening up with every gun and torpedo launcher they possessed, as they realized that this cruiser was actually a much larger and much more dangerous vessel. Luckily, all 34 long-lance torpedoes fired at her somehow missed or were evaded. But now a hail of shells came blasting in. Most of these were smaller caliber weapons from the fast-firing destroyers and cruisers, although a number of 14-inch from Kirishima joined the party as well. As systems began to flicker back to life, South Dakota returned fire with her secondary battery first, and then as systems on the main battery came back on, they fired off a few salvos. But then the shock of the guns kept flipping the breakers again, and so the radar went off again. Then it briefly came back to life, but, as with most naval engagements, the hits concentrated themselves around the forward superstructure. This, in some ways, was good for South Dakota. You can't actually sink a ship by blowing holes in the superstructure. But in other ways it was very bad, as the radar operators got to see their screens go dark for a third time, this time permanently, as incoming enemy fire, shrapnel, and explosions tore apart South Dakota's radio, radar, and primary fire control mountings. Her guns were now working, but there was nothing they could see to shoot at. Any attempts to use the rangefinders mounted on the turrets yielded only the glare of searchlights and flames from the various parts of the ship that were now on fire. Unable to fight and unable to communicate with Admiral Lee, South Dakota was forced to veer away from the bombardment, which had landed over 24 hits and caused over 100 casualties. Kirishima got in hits with all kinds of 14-inch shells, including high explosive, the adapted Type 3 anti-aircraft dash bombardment shells, and at least one 14-inch armor-piercing shell, possibly more. South Dakota lucked out with this last one, as at the close range the fighting was happening at, there was a not insignificant chance of the shell penetrating most of the way through the armour of the aft barbette, which is what it hit, before detonating, which would not have been good as it could have propelled a lot of very hot splinters of armour into the barbette itself. However, the shell appears to have skipped off the deck just before the barbette, breaking the armour-piercing cap, and also appears to have impacted off perpendicular, thanks to South Dakota's turn away, and the precise location of the hit on the barbette. So the impact ended up doing relatively minimal damage compared to what could have happened. Damage control crews also rapidly extinguished a fire in the 5-inch shell handling room, which had threatened to spread to the 5-inch magazines. Whilst this free-for-all against South Dakota was going on, away in the darkness, Washington had been tracking a large target on its radar, whilst dodging through drifting fields of debris and survivors from the US escorts, some of whom had yelled encouragement at the battleship to avenge their own vessels. But with South Dakota unable to communicate, and having apparently wandered off into the darkness on her own, Lee didn't want to open fire based purely on radar returns, in case the contact was the errant US battleship. The Japanese assault, however, removed all doubts as to who was who, since now Lee could not only see exactly where the beleaguered South Dakota was, highlighted as she was by searchlights and flames, but he could also match the large target on his radar to the shadowy form of the Kirishima. The Japanese had either completely forgotten about the second large US ship, or else were completely tunnel-focused on working over the South Dakota. Either way, Washington closed in through the darkness like the swift predator of the seas that she was, and one likes to imagine Lee crying,
"Hello, it's me!"
opening fire at near enough point-blank range with her heavy guns and the secondary battery almost simultaneously. Half of the 5-inch guns joining in the 16-inch guns in targeting Kirishima, whilst the rest contented themselves with blasting away at Atago. Unengaged, at close range, and with a crack gunnery crew, Washington tore Kirishima apart. The Japanese ship had just stopped firing at South Dakota, but only Atago spotted the incoming Washington, and then only when it actually opened fire. Washington landed almost 24 main battery hits and a similar number of secondary battery hits within about 5 minutes of devastating fire, probably hitting with the first salvo and then continuously afterwards, with a brief interval during the destruction to allow Lee to evaluate the results. Ever the professional, Lee and Washington would only claim the main battery hits that were spectacular enough to be seen and definitely counted as 16-inch, accounting for something of the discrepancy between the official US Navy claims immediately after the war and the actual facts of the matter as shown by the wreck. Aboard the Kirishima, the crew had a rather more front-line perspective, and they would mention many more hits, including a number below the waterline. As mentioned, later analysis of the wreck, somewhat complicated by the fact the ship actually flipped over on its way down and then had the forward magazines detonate, confirmed the presence of a number of underwater hits and thus lend credence to the Japanese accounts. So Admiral Lee did actually far better than he thought, and he thought he did pretty darn well. First, The radio room went, then the forward guns, then the forward magazines had to be flooded, and the damage just kept on coming. With water pouring in from below, fires all around above, and the main guns disabled, plus the rudder being jammed, the crippled battlecruiser went into a series of uncontrollable turns. Only the inner shafts were working by this point, making counter-steering using the outer shafts impossible. As smoke and hot gases from the fires above got sucked into the engine rooms via their air intakes, even these remaining engineering spaces had to be abandoned, and the ships began to slow. Kirishima, to its credit, managed a few return salvos before its systems died completely, but none of them landed any hits before the last of the 14-inch guns were knocked out. Washington's only damage would be a hole in her air search radar antenna, either from a destroyer's main battery gun or possibly a secondary gun from one of the cruisers or Kirishima. Admiral Kondo was now commanding from Atago, and despite this rather spectacular reversal, ordered his surviving ships to seek and destroy any American vessels left. In a way, you can see why. All the American destroyers were sunk or had retreated, South Dakota had broken off crippled, and there was surely just one ship left, and he still had all his cruisers. All but one of his destroyers was still afloat, and he had plenty of torpedoes. The only problem was, nobody actually knew where Kirishima's killer actually was. After a bit of searching, they finally spotted Washington heading away from them in an effort to lure the Japanese away from the South Dakota. This bait worked, the remaining Japanese vessels launching volleys of long lances her way, but Admiral Lee took his ship on a merry dance, threading through the various Type 93s and the shallow waters that could have left him a sitting duck. The US battleship slipped away into the night to evaluate the situation. Lee might have inflicted a body blow to the Japanese formation, but he was now in charge of the only operational US surface vessel in the area. He wasn't leaving the field, though. He'd gotten the reports of the surviving Japanese transports, and finding himself having now bypassed the main Japanese formation, he decided to head after them. For his part, despite now technically having the way open to him to shoot up Henderson Field with his cruisers, Kondo appears to have forgotten about the Cactus Air Force and instead broke off and headed home, leaving Ayanami to be scuttled and 4 destroyers to pick up the survivors from both the destroyer and Kirishima. In terms of casualties, it was actually about an even score, with both sides losing between 240 and 250 men each. And whilst the Japanese had lost a destroyer and a battlecruiser, the US had lost 3 destroyers, and with another heavily damaged, and had had a battleship crippled. But, unlike the previous engagements, the US Navy hadn't left the Japanese Navy in control of the field of battle. Both sides had fallen back, with Washington and South Dakota meeting up for the journey out, and the Japanese Navy's actual objective had been left unfulfilled. This would be compounded later that morning when the 4 transports, realizing they weren't safe from American attention, beached themselves to prevent air attack from sinking them, only to be set on fire regardless by strikes from the Cactus Air Force and US land-based artillery, killing hundreds of the troops they'd brought in and destroying much of the desperately needed heavy equipment and supplies. This not only meant that the Japanese army attack on Henderson Field was now very unlikely to succeed, but the loss of all the transport ships meant another attempt would not be forthcoming, even if Admiral Yamamoto was prepared to throw Kongo and Haruna in after Kirishima and Hiei. With only warships able to make the supply runs, and with a couple of thousand extra mouths to feed from the survivors of the beach transports, the Japanese army forces were looking at a slow death by gradual starvation unless the Japanese Navy could get really inventive really fast. For their part, the US Navy recognised what a gamble it had been, even if it had paid off, Lee commenting that US battleships clearly were not designed for the kind of close-range, point-blank battles that they'd encountered. But it hadn't been a choice. Without Henderson Field, the less than 24 aircraft aboard Enterprise would have been the only remaining air cover, so it had to be defended. All of this would lead to one last major naval battle in the Guadalcanal Campaign. But the 15th of November marked a transition point. This was the last time the Japanese surface forces would sail offensively with the goal of advancing objectives related to pushing the increasingly ad hoc American forces back and themselves forward. From now on, the situation would generally be the US Navy on the front foot, usually in strength, and the Japanese making increasingly desperate attempts to defend themselves against the American advance. Whilst South Dakota would be out of action for about 3 months, Washington, of course, was still available for action. And whilst locally, Halsey had suffered from a distinct lack of available cruisers and destroyers for this second night action, the overall status of the US Navy was getting stronger and stronger. More destroyers and more cruisers, and indeed more battleships, were coming down the line, and fairly soon reinforcements would arrive, bringing US Navy forces back up to near enough full strength, whilst the Japanese losses were pretty much irreplaceable and took with them an awful lot of experienced crewmen, which badly depleted the Japanese ability to respond to further American incursions later on. The Japanese Navy was by no means down and out. It would continue to try and resupply the troops on Guadalcanal, and there would be a number of further engagements, albeit none on the scale of this. But it was very much definitely on a downward slide towards the status that it would reach by 1945. Indeed, within less than 3 months, the Japanese would conclude their position on Guadalcanal was untenable and begin a retreat and evacuation. Although, that would not be without contest, as we'll see in future videos. You may have noticed this pair of videos has been accompanied by a significant amount of animation, and that's been courtesy of the Operations Room, a fine channel which has collaborated with me in presenting you this battle, both here and on their channel. So if you like watching animated sections of military history, please go and check their channel out, and once again, thank you very much for all their hard work putting the animated side of this battle together.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.